I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we can believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast. I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
I'm Matt Bernico, and I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week we're talking to Katie Grimes. She's a really amazing scholar who does a lot of work on anti-Blackness supremacy and the Catholic Church in particular, but Christianity a little more generally. And we were thinking about how to introduce her, and we decided to just shamelessly lift this description from her author page at Fortress Press. Fortress sent us a review copy of the book, so that's very kind of them. They say, Katie Walker Grimes is assistant professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University. She's the author of Fugitive Saints, Catholicism and the Politics of Slavery, and she has published articles on the relation of white supremacy and the Catholic Church in a number of important journals. And she's a regular contributing author to the blog Women in Theology, which is a great blog. Folks should follow. Amori Armstrong has some posts there as well. And great stuff. But really excited to have Katie Grimes on the show.
Yeah, Katie's books are always really enlightening to me, for sure. Well, you also might know her from her indirect appearance on Rod Dreher's critically acclaimed internet fart blog, where she appears in no less than 7 posts.
real fixated, that Rod.
Yeah, Rod just has a thing here. Yeah. Well, one of the posts where Rod, no one has ever read my book, Dreher, calls her America's theological sweetheart, TM. Or you might also know her from the last time she was on our show talking about her really amazing book, Fugitive Saints. That's an episode you should go check out after this one. Anyways, Rod Dreher, not a huge fan of Katie Grimes, but guess what? We are. I can't even imagine being like as smart and nice as Katie Grimes is, and then like having someone like Rod Dreher come out like from the internet woodwork every time she says something and like just spews garbage. It's so terrible.
I know. Yeah, imagine being someone who like wrote 2 books dealing with Afro-pessimism, which is like one of the most difficult and interesting and like most sort of like radical theoretical literatures that you can read right now. Imagine like writing 2 books about that and then having a guy who like defends Paula Deen in a number of posts, just saying like, yeah, she's not racist and like butter is good. Like That's the intellectual caliber. It's too bad.
Pretty wild. Well, let's get into it and throw it over to Katie. All right, this week we have Katie Grimes on the show to talk about her new-ish book called Christ Divided, Anti-Blackness as Corporate Vice. Katie, before we get started, do you want to just like tell us what you've been up to this past week?
Oh, wow. This past week I have been full-time. Basically, I'm on leave watching my 11-month-old baby. So that's pretty much been all I've done this week. That's my life. So, not active, but not that exciting. Yeah.
For sure. That's cool. Dean, what have you been doing, man?
I've been super busy with just work and writing, but nothing exciting to report, really. Just keeping my head above the water. Oh, yeah. I made a bunch of stickers. That's what I've been doing all week, making stickers.
Sticker guy. That's cool. Good Magnificast stickers, huh?
Yeah. How about you, Matt?
I went to the zoo yesterday, saw some animals, got sunburnt as hell. That is what I've been doing.
Nice. That sounds fun, though.
Yeah, it was a great time. Cool. Well, thanks, Katie, for coming back on the Magnificast. This is the second time you've been on. Did this book come out right after the first time you came on? Is that how it worked out?
I think so. I don't remember exactly what month it was, but yeah, I think it came out in November of 2017. So yeah, it's around the time.
Yeah, cool. Just like always, we're going to start off this conversation asking you to give like an elevator pitch for your book. So what made you want to write it? What were you trying to accomplish with it? Do you think that you'd accomplish that thing?
Yeah, so I assume this is like not an elevator ride to space, right? So I'm going to do like I mean, it's in a lot. This was kind of grew out of my dissertation, which grew out, I guess, kind of like a lot of things in my life for many years. But what made me, just basically I was, kind of paying attention to the way, I guess, theologians, in particular Catholic theologians, because that's kind of like my location, we're talking about racism and white supremacy, and then also kind of trying to connect the way, quote unquote, popular discourse, not that, we want to separate those too much, like just kind of people like on blogs or on HuffPost or Facebook, people just, in the world are talking about race and racism. And I guess maybe one of the main impetuses of it is try to find better language, both better in the sense of like more accurate, more descriptive, but then also more like rhetorically effective. So I don't know, I guess, I think there's probably like 4 or 5 different thrusts or streams going on in the book, but that might be one of the most underlying. So, and by more effective, I mean more effective at, I guess, working for racial justice. That sounds, cheesy, but that's what I mean by effective.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's one thing I really appreciate reading this book too, is you do get a sense of both, I guess, what's in the air culturally or something like that, and then also what so-called like professional people talking about these issues looks like. Like that's a really good balance that you strike, I think.
Oh, thank you. It's good to hear.
So maybe we could start out just getting some of the like technical tools that you use out on the table so people kind of know what we're talking about. So you make a lot of specific vocabulary choices in your book, and you make some of the same ones that you do in the Fugitive Saints book, so people who've listened to that, I guess, already might know what you're talking about, but it's worth covering the same ground. So you say in the book that you prefer to talk about anti-blackness supremacy rather than white supremacy, for example. For those who don't know what that is or haven't had a chance to hear that from you, could you explain why you would prefer to use anti-blackness supremacy in your work?
Sure. So like my dissertation, I was kind of writing it like in the 2012 era, I guess the re-election of President Obama. And, it was really my first time kind of writing something sort of comprehensive, thinking about race and racism. And my dissertation, I used white supremacy. But really, I mean, I talked, in the historical section a little, about the, displacement and genocide of indigenous people, but really the main thrust of it was what I would now say, anti-blackness or, anti-black racism. And then kind of in between the President Obama's second reelection and then the time I kind of heavily revised this into the book that now exists, we had the eruption, in a good way, I'm using eruption positively, of Black Lives Matter movement. I started following some people on Twitter, most notably people like Mariame Kaba, Twitter handle Prison Culture. Everyone should be following her. And they started, they were talking specifically about anti-blackness. And it was kind of happening in the dissertation. I just did a lot of apologizing of like, yeah, I'm talking about white supremacy. Lots of groups are victimized by white supremacy, but I'm kind of focusing on, white, black stuff, and so in the course of that, again, not really my idea, the anti-blackness thing, just kind of paying attention to what activists on the ground and then some, activist scholars were saying. I realized that just from a subjective standpoint, my deepest interest was in anti-black racism or anti-blackness. And in terms of like, so why I chose to focus on one or the other, it's not at all a denial of the existence of like the broader phenomenon of white supremacy. Like it's not to deny the existence of, what we might call anti-Asian racism or, racism against like mestizo or, brown skin, Latinos or Hispanics or anything like that, or certainly not Native Americans. It was kind of just a recognition that my passion, but a recognition that there are certain commonalities between the racisms that all peoples of color face, but they really are like kind of separate species. And I think, a lot of times we can say, oh, she's talking about anti-Black racism. So you're saying like Black people have it worse, or what about, certainly right now what's going on at the border with people from Central America who are, overwhelmingly brown skin, mestizo and indigenous. And it's not so much like, oh, because I think Black people have it worse, quote unquote. It's just, I think, again, like in terms of accuracy and kind of these rhetorical pitfalls I see everybody getting into, I just think there's a need in certain circumstances to say anti-Black racism is a different species, right? Like Black people are persecuted, oppressed for different reasons, and they kind of tend to suffer different, forms. Like, for example, African-American people don't generally come up to them and say, oh, where are you from? Where are you really from? That's kind of a microaggression that, you hear Asian American people talking about, right? So it's just kind of carving out a space for us to really attend to the specificity of all of these things. I think that's very super lacking in all across the political spectrum. We're just lumping things together.
Yeah, that's helpful. You mentioned that it is like a sort of a rhetorical strategy or a different way to think about, race. And I think that's a really good note. There's a part, I think early on in the first chapter, or maybe the second chapter, I don't know, one of the chapters, you talk about anti-Blackness against the paradigm of sort of white privilege. And I think that's pretty interesting to me. So white privilege at this point is like a pretty popular and sort of normative thing for people to talk about. But could you say a little bit about why anti-Blackness supremacy is a more helpful rhetoric than white privilege, and then maybe like make a suggestion about why people who use white privilege rhetoric should maybe make the switch or think about it in a different way?
Yeah, sure. So, we want to be careful. Like I had a professor, Max Johnson at Notre Dame, a master's degree. He had a saying, don't mess with people's piety. Kind of like we theologians, we like to say, come and tell people their way of praying or connecting to God is wrong, right? And his point was kind of that's people's entryway, that's people's relationship to God, right? So it's kind of an analogous thing I want to say with the white privilege thing. Like for a lot of people, white privilege is kind of their entry point to this reality that we have a racist society. So it's not that I want to make people feel stupid or like they're bad or wrong for using it, because it's certainly in the world of like anti-racism workshops, like that can really be a way that white people, their entry point. But it's just that it's not so much that white privilege doesn't exist. It's just when we don't want to take that as like the root cause of everything, right? I would say white privilege is a symptom of the larger phenomenons that I would say, of white supremacy or, anti-Blackness supremacy. So, there's several reasons, but, one of them would be even, I would say first we should shift from, when we're talking about, uniform racism, I think we should talk about white supremacy over white privilege. And the main reason for that is because I think the phrase, the root problem, the root cause of racial inequality is racialized power, right? There's a power inequality, right? White people, both as individuals and as a group, have more power than people of color, right? So quite simply, like not trying to be glib about it, let's literally call it what it is. It's white supremacy. And white privilege can certainly be a consequence, can be like a side effect of that, but it's not like the root cause. So then, if we extend that to thinking about the specificity of what Black people go through, that's kind of just extending that insight and saying, okay, anti-Blackness supremacy, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? It puts the focus on that, again, specificity. Black people are going through, their experience, both historically and in the present, is unique, which of course, and also means other groups' experiences are unique too, right? That's the other flip side. I think that maybe I didn't articulate enough, but maybe people might not realize, right? In saying what Black people go through is unique, I'm also saying what Mexican Americans have gone through is unique, right? But it's also, I think, because there's something, especially with anti-Black racism, all non-Black people, not just white people, although certainly white people are the most morally responsible and probably benefit the most, but all non-Black people can participate in and benefit from the power generated through anti-Blackness. So those are the reasons why I kind of chose the term anti-Blackness supremacy, right? So again, it's just the description is there in the name, or at least that was my intention, right? We've got power, we've got blackness, and we've got the anti, right? And I don't know, I'll let you guys ask if there's, I wrote a book about it, right? So I mean, like I can go on and on, but I'll let you guys ask more about like what particular things of that are interesting to you.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely get into especially more about, I guess, how you want to like resist that and combat that, like combating white supremacy and anti-blackness supremacy more specifically. But maybe like one last kind of stage setting thing I thought might be helpful would be to talk about sort of the first, I guess, third of your book, where you rehearse, I think in a really like accessible way, kind of like a brief history of Black slavery and how it constitutes the backdrop and eventual founding of the United States. So obviously, I mean, not asking you to give a giant world history lesson real quick, but you do an interesting thing drawing off of Saidiya Hartman, saying we inhabit not the aftermath of Black slavery, but its afterlife. So maybe you could just spin that out a little bit for us a bit, like what is the afterlife of slavery, and why is that also maybe one last kind of table setting thing that would help us get into what you're working with here?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I should say, filling in the blanks more of that, in between dissertation stage 2012 and 2015 or so, I discovered a group of scholars that are sometimes called the Afro-pessimists, right? Of whom Saidiya Hartman is often, considered to be one of them. And they really helped me crystallize these kind of like seminal or like nascent insights about anti-Blackness, right? So her concept, afterlife of slavery, again, in a lot of ways, I'm just kind of like taking other people's ideas and kind of putting them together, right? Not much in this book is like truly original, right? I will admit. So her, afterlife of slavery is basically, it's again, I think what she does here, kind of something that I was trying to emulate, right? I think the meaning of it is right there in the word, right? Afterlife of slavery. So, if you think slavery is it's dead, but it's also alive, right? And I guess you could really unpack it as poetically as possible. I guess I'll say the way I interpret it, or the way I ran with it, is just that anti-Black racism, anti-Blackness has carried on kind of in the shape of, or in the form of, what I call Africanized slavery. So it's not just like, again, specificity, right? It's not just like, well, slavery ended and then white people still hated Black people. And so they just, they were, mistreated them. And then that was Jim Crow. You can kind of see that Jim Crow is kind of like a mutated or modified kind of version of Africanized slavery. Not that it was slavery, right? Again, I'm not equating Jim Crow with slavery, but it's the point that it kind of, if we think of Black slavery as not just something that happened to individual Black people, right? But a racial, like kind of a thing that helped to, I mean, we think of it as racialized, right? A race-making institution, right? So we think of Africanized slavery, Jim Crow, and we could think, the Black ghetto, especially in northern cities, or today, war on drugs or mass incarceration. They help to keep that association between slavery and Blackness and Black people alive, right? So not that Jim Crow is the same as slavery, although, scholars have done great work talking about how slavery actually did continue, right? Chain gang and all that kind of stuff. But that it helped keep the association and kind of the structural dynamics alive, basically. So that means, white people could preserve many of the pleasures and powers of slave owning, of racialized slave owning, right? So that's kind of the way, I think that's like what she's saying. That's also kind of the way I took it and kind of like unpacked it and elaborated it. So that's kind of, I guess, my interpretation of her term. Her, I think her book, Lose Your Mother, which everyone should read, that's where she really gives her definition, but that's the way I kind of took it. Another thing that it kind of occurred to me in doing all of this, and Orlando Patterson, he was kind of, he wrote in the early 1980s, but is sometimes kind of grouped in with the Afro-pessimists too. I also realized another problem in the West in general. And I don't hate to use the term the West, but just for, Europe, all of the Americas, nobody really knows what slavery is, right? Which is kind of ironic because slavery is our dominant kind of political and moral metaphor. Even if we're not using the word slaves or slavery, like all of our political discourse, everybody is kind of positioning themselves as slaves, implicitly or explicitly. Like, so, all the freedom rhetoric on and on, women's rights movement, gay rights movement, across the spectrum. But I realized the what actually constitutes slavery, like people actually really don't know what slavery is, right? We have kind of an overly generalized concept of slavery, or too narrow, right? So the overly generalized could be, coercion. So you hear Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, talking about taxes as a form of slavery, right? Because he has this notion, people are being coerced, which absolutely people are being coerced. To me, an overly specific would be the notion that slavery is when you are forced to work, or, again, coerced to work for little to no pay, right, in substandard conditions, right? And so I said, well, if we're going to say that anti-Blackness supremacy, right, is kind of upholding or carrying on the afterlife of slavery, in order, again, to be specific and to actually delineate what anti-Black racism is, we have to actually know what slavery is, right? So that was kind of the other piece, is to show how slavery is something like specific, like it's a unique condition. Again, not that there's a million ways that people can mistreat and oppress people, right? So it's not, again, I'm not trying to minimize, I'm a woman, I'm not all trying to minimize like patriarchy or, homophobia or anything like that. But again, it's specific, it's, species specific. So once we get a hold of how, what slaves in general go through is different than the oppression women face under patriarchy, right? Or gay people under homophobia, or workers under capitalism, right? Or feudalism or whatever. That can then help us kind of trace the line through history and see, okay, and I just think it helps us get clarity. I don't know, we might get to this, but I just think, like, just take, for example, I think when it comes to race, like racism and classism, I think they often get used against each other, right? Like they often get kind of like they're the same thing, and they're kind of like fighting for the same rhetorical space. And so for me, the clarity isn't about saying, hey, let's only talk about this one thing. It's actually the opposite. I'm trying to give more like rhetorical life to all the good fights that people are fighting in society. And I think because I think anti-Black racism is uniquely foundational, but also just because of the role of, this metaphor, people don't maybe realize it's a metaphor, this metaphor or analogy of slavery, right? Everybody's trying to position themselves as slaves, whether they realize it or not, like rhetorically. I just think we have to get clear on this, right? We have to just let Black people's experience be unique, and other groups agitating for their rights have to stop trying to use Black people, right? I think maybe I say this in Fugitive Saints, I don't know, but I kind of say, we use the metaphor of slavery in the kind of political realm, it has a fungibility kind of in the way like slave masters use slaves, right? Kind of an ironic way. It's just something, it's like the ultimate tool, right? People just use it, make of it what they want. So we have to like really stop that.
Yeah, for sure. In the very first chapter of your book, too, you have that Orlando Peterson quote that says, "The permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons." That's like slavery as a definition. And it is a little bit different than the way we usually think about it. In the next few sentences, you even go on and say, "Although the capitalist certainly deploys power to coerce the proletariat into working for him, he does not drive the proletariat into his fields or sweatshops by beating or mutilating him as the slave master does." So I think you do a really good job of doing that clarifying work of sort of differentiating anti-Blackness from other types of like oppression. I think that's helpful and good.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, what you are people who are very passionate, knowledgeable about labor issues. I guess it means a lot that you think that that's true, because I worry about it saying like, let's not worry about don't worry about capitalism, right?
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I don't hear that. I think Dean and I are always trying to figure out ways to talk about like race and labor together in ways that doesn't sort of like reduce it to some type of like primary oppression or something. Exactly. Draw those things out. So I think it's helpful in that sense. Well, moving on a little bit. So the second part of your book was a lot more challenging for me as a Protestant, because I have no idea what is going on with Thomism and like a lot of virtue theory stuff. So since we set the table for some of the anti-Blackness supremacy language, could you tell us a little bit about like virtue ethics and like where your work is at in that kind of area?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so again, kind of in the same way that I was a little unsatisfied with the existing kind of like terms that we use to name, racism, for lack of a better term right now, I kind of was like similarly unsatisfied with kind of the, moral, I don't even know what to call them, moral terms, right? So, you hear, maybe in Protestant circles, but in Catholic circles, you hear, concepts like structural sin, right, and social sin, and which I certainly think exists, right, or Catholic theologians talking about how white people are complicit in white supremacy or complicit in racism. Basically, theologians, and this is more of the theological conversation, less so than the popular one, but we're trying to figure out a way, because I think with racism in particular, but maybe all, capitalism, patriarchy too, we're trying to figure out how to connect the individual white person to this ultimately like social phenomenon, right? Even though, white people are living diverse lives and doing different things right there. I mean, there's a notion that basically like, oh, I'm not racist. Like I don't use the N-word, or, just to use a very obvious, simple example. So all these attempts like structural sin, social sin, complicity, are trying to like basically, and white privilege too, trying to get white people to take responsibility, if not to recognize their own guilt, right? And I think like all those phenomena exist. I think they're structural sin. I think they're social sin, right? I do think white people are complicit, but I kind of thought they were like letting white people off the hook. And so again, my location, right, in Catholic theology at Boston College at the time, like one of my mentors, James Keenan, has done a lot, along with other people at Boston College, to kind of retrieve Thomism, to retrieve Aquinas, to give like natural law or virtue ethics a more, in my opinion, like a better interpretation. It kind of had one very notion of that natural law or virtue theory is just, received law, like a set of rules to follow. And Jim Keenan's done a lot to show that that's not quite the case. And I'll get into that in a second. And so typically in virtue theory, I mean, it's pretty, there's actually been, Jennifer Hurt has done some work with virtue theory showing that it can be a Protestant thing too. So check that out if you're into that from a Protestant angle. But basically the whole point of virtue theory is like there's a connection between what we do and who we are, right? So, I mean, if you played sports or you play sports or like played an instrument, just think like if you want to learn to become good at the flute, what do? Like you practice the flute, right? Or in sports, practice like it's game day. You don't just practice willy-nilly. Like if you don't, practice the way you want to play, right? So that's basically it. So virtue theory tries to look at, it's not just about prescribing moral laws, but it's about building character, right? So that for example, if you are like, you could do something mean, doesn't necessarily make you a mean person, right? But if you're like a mean person, it means you have kind of like a disposition to treat people meanly, right? Like that's kind of your default setting, kind of like almost like your autopilot, So again, if we think of like a musician, think of how little effort it takes to play the violin, well, when you're like a world-class musician, right? But when you're first practicing, it takes a lot of effort. It's really hard, right? You might not do it very well. Because that's basically all virtue theory is. That's virtue ethics, right? And so that's kind of, again, the individual level. And like one of my beefs with white privilege talk is it's too individualizing. So we get in this thing where we're like, well, how can you say I have white privilege? Like I'm like, I'm a woman. So how can you say I have white privilege when I'm a woman? This, black man, he's, he has more privilege than me. It just gets in this like endless individual comparison, right? When certainly anti-blackness supremacy and white supremacy affect individuals, but they're ultimately, they're kind of corporate experiences or corporate phenomenon. So I just kind of took the concepts of virtue theory and said, hey, maybe the same thing, the thing that happens with individuals, that we acquire habits based upon, how we live and what we do. Maybe the same thing is true with like corporate bodies, right? Both in the sense of like white people in general have like kind of corporate habits, but like literally just the body of Christ, like the church. And so again, working from a Catholic perspective, looking at the way the church kind of acts as a corporate entity, right? So the Catholic parish. So if you just look, there's patterns, right? That Catholic parishes all over the Northeast and the Midwest, when they were white, which was, most of the parishes in the early 20th and mid 20th century, they kind of all acted the same way when it came to black people, right? And that was, they tried to keep them out of their neighborhoods. And then when they couldn't keep them out of their neighborhoods, they got up and they fled, right? So that to me is, that's it. That's corporate virtue theory. So it's just a better way to try to explain what is going on and how people are both responsible for and I guess culpable for, how they participate in anti-blackness supremacy.
Yeah, that's a really great explanation. When you're talking about it, it just sort of, I think, is especially interesting to me as someone who's also Catholic and thinking through how to inhabit the Catholic tradition as a thinking person. And Thomism often turns me off, I think, mostly because of like most Thomists that I've met in general, which is obviously like not a great way to evaluate a certain theory, but I appreciate that. I feel like a little bit less allergic to it now, having read your book. And I was thinking, there's a long history of like critical Thomism, you might call it, with people like Herbert McCabe or like M. Sean Copeland doing work on virtue and racism in the U.S. But I guess maybe you could say a little bit more about like how the way that you and others are taking up that tradition relates to like some of these more like conservative or traditionalist ways of using it. Like, it seems like a really cool rhetorical tactic because you're automatically, hopefully, going to get a hearing from somebody that might not otherwise listen if you frame it in the terms of someone like Thomas Aquinas. But at the same time, I can imagine a lot of Thomists being like really upset by the things that you say in your book.
Well, that's exactly it, for better or for worse, like in the Catholic world. And there's a lot of history behind this, right? Because when the actual person, Thomas Aquinas, was living, he wasn't the, authoritative figure he is today. But for various reasons, Thomas Aquinas is very authoritative within the Catholic world, right? Like, if you can prove that Thomas Aquinas is on your side, then that's like, that's like a really big deal. Like, that's a feather in your cap, especially like on sex and gender issues. I sometimes say, like, sometimes talking to my undergrads, I say, in general, again, overgeneralizing, talking about like, say, gay marriage or homosexuality or whatever, Protestants, quotation marks, tend to argue about what does the Bible say about it, right? Whereas Catholics are talking about, well, what does, natural law, right? Which is kind of a way of saying, what does Thomas Aquinas say about it, right? So kind of, I guess, the school of Thomism that I guess I'm affiliated with basically would want to say, natural law isn't a set of like rules, right? Like just prescriptions, like do this, don't do this, don't do this. It's a way of knowing the truth, right? A way of knowing God's will. So basically, as I would interpret it at its most simple form, it's two things. God created us to flourish, to be happy, not like a glib, oh, like I'm happy, I'm eating Starburst or something, but like a true flourishing, to be truly human, to be truly happy, and that we can, like, with reasonable certainty, figure out what that entails, like how to do that. So it's more of like a method, right? So it's a very broadly inductive method, like something, again, that kind of people who think like I do want to emphasize about Aquinas is he kind of had this notion that, all truth is one. So all sources of knowledge have to agree, right? So the so thinking about a moral issue, scripture has to agree, the quote unquote authorities of the day. So today, whoever that would be, like scientists or whatever, they have to agree. Virtue theory has to agree, has to be virtuous, and on and on. And if something's out of whack, right? If let's say the Bible, so in my opinion, a Thomist approach would say, if scripture says one thing and the scientists say another, someone's wrong. Or not that the Bible's wrong, but either the scientists are wrong, or we've interpreted the science wrong, or we've interpreted scripture wrong, right? So it's broadly inductive, which means as we learn new things, as the world changes, as our society change, our understanding of what it takes to flourish might change. So that's how I see Thomism. Now, of course, there are not that, that's not the way everyone sees it. And certainly in the Catholic world, Thomas is kind of more associated with a quote unquote conservative approach to things. But yeah, so I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my, like, I guess my pitch for Aquinas as to why I think he is actually an ally for people, working for justice and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's super helpful as a person kind of outside that area. That makes me kind of understand what's going on a little bit better.
One more thing to summarize, I guess. Yeah. The debate is certainly like, is Thomism what Aquinas thought about things? Is it his conclusions, or is it his method? Right. So, if it's Aquinas's conclusions, then sure, women are inferior, on and on. But if it's his approach to knowledge, I think that allows for a lot of progress, I guess we could say.
Yeah. Cool. Well, as you kind of go on in your book, you kind of bring in some other thinkers who Dean and I at least kind of love to hate, Stanley Hauerwas and William Kavanaugh. Yeah, you bring them in and you kind of give them this label called sacramental optimism. And I think that their positions are really attractive for a lot of Christians who want to be countercultural, especially sort of on like the liberal left side of things. I know that's how I got into reading Hauerwas in the first place. But as you suggest, there's something like pretty naive about the way they idealize the church. Could you describe what that position is and some of its shortcomings and like what it has to do with anti-Blackness?
Sure. Well, and I will say, like, I picked those two thinkers because, I mean, certainly, especially in the case of Hauerwas, you know, they've kind of written the most interestingly, you know, generated the most energy about something I think is like a much larger kind of belief system among a lot of Christians across the political spectrum, right? And that's basically, and you kind of see it gathering steam with the sacraments, with baptism and the Eucharist in particular. And it's kind of just this notion that if we just, you know, do the sacraments right, or, you know, and whatever that might be, right, or, you know, do the church's practices correct, that, you know, in the case of racism, that we can fight, you know, racism that way. So, I mean, you know, most obviously we think of the Eucharist, right? Well, again, like, I agree that's how it should be, right? Certainly, like, the sacrament in which we become one body in a racially segregated society, that would seem, wow, that's like a very powerful anecdote to a social order that says, you know, Black and white people shouldn't live in the same, or, you know, shouldn't live in the same neighborhoods, right? So it, you know, it's very powerful, but I guess, again, so that's why it's called optimism. And so I kind of go for something I called sacramental realism. And that's, you know, realism in the sense of taking seriously, like, history, right? Like, that we have to at a certain point and say, hey, that's great theory, but, like, has it ever happened, right? Or does it happen on, you know, again, habitually, right? The virtue again, does it happen on a regular basis? And if you look at history, right, the history of sacramentally active communities in anti-Black spaces, no, not only has it not worked, but, you know, you can make a case, as I kind of do, looking at the 20th century, these kind of very storied, the white ethnic immigrant parishes in places like Philadelphia and Boston and Chicago that were super, super tight knit, right? So super Eucharistically cohesive, super, you know, the parish, the physical space, as well as kind of the concept of the parish, was literally the center of people's, not just spiritual lives, but their social lives, right? Their political lives. That those communities, which were, like, you could say were the, like, model of Eucharistic cohesiveness, were super, 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 super racist, right? And so I'm kind of just saying we have to, like, take that seriously, like, that I'm not, and that's not, like, God's fault. That's not necessarily, like, the Eucharist's fault. Like, that may be our fault, but it's something is happening wherein the Eucharist and baptism, precisely because they are about the body and they are about unity and they are, you know, they are super susceptible to the habituating, right? There's that virtue ethics again, the virtue theory, the habituating power of anti-Blackness supremacy, right? So basically the kind of the my motto is, like, it's not enough to reform the church from within, right? Because we are living in a habituate, like, racism, anti-Blackness supremacy. It's kind of like the air we breathe, right? Or the food we eat. It's habituating. Even if we don't want to, like, it's just, you are formed by your environment, right? Not determined, but you are, you know, shaped by it. You are habituated by it. And so, and again, I also call it sacramental realism because I'm actually trying to say, let's take the realness of Christ's body, you know, both in the church and the sacrament, like, let's take it, you know, more seriously. So I'm not trying to say we have to take a choice between the sacraments, you know, from a Catholic perspective, from a approach to the sacraments, what says the Eucharist is the real presence of Jesus, but one that, you know, for the sake of the real presence, right? Let's take the bodiliness of individual Christians, of the church as a corporate body, of the Eucharist. Let's take that, like, more seriously. So basically, rather than saying, you know, Hauerwas, and I know I'm not, like, trying to hate on Hauerwas as a person here. And I know a lot of the things he says, it's to be provocative, to stir people up, to get them to examine their kind of taken for granted assumptions, right? So, you know, he has this kind of famous saying, you know, justice or working for justice is a bad idea or something, right? And because he says that he thinks when the church tries to get involved in quote unquote politics or statecraft, it ends up, like, first of all, it doesn't really have much effect and ends up losing itself. And my kind of response to that, and I'm not necessarily trying to limit our imaginations to electoral politics by any sense, by any means, but is to say, rather than, choosing between ecclesial integrity or justice in the world, we have to realize that justice, enables ecclesial integrity, right? Like, how can we expect Christians are just going to have these magical force fields that are going to protect us from the habituating power of anti-Blackness supremacy? It's just it's not the case, right? So so that's part of it. Yeah, that's kind of part of it. So I don't want Christians to stop receiving the sacraments or building church community or anything like that. But I just want them to realize that we are habituated by this, no matter, just like air we breathe, right? We metabolize it, right? Our bodies, it's in our bodies.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying all of that because, I don't know, I'm trying to be less crabby in my life, but I'm going to give into this vice for now. I feel like I just get so sort of, my temper really flares up actually when I talk to a lot of especially conservative Catholics about the Eucharist, because there is this sense that it's like, well, you're eating God, so of course that should change everything that you think about the whole world. And it's like, well, that would be nice, but have you ever gone to church? Yeah, most people who go to church and take the Eucharist every Sunday, unfortunately, don't leave, thinking that capitalism is an exploitative system of economics, or that, Black people deserve to be human beings in a society. So, yeah, I don't know, it's a really good corrective, and I want to pull out this quote that you have about Hauerwas in particular, in your book. I tweeted it out a little while back, but I just thought it was so great. So you say, you rehearse Hauerwas's position a little bit, but then you say, so Hauerwas is drawing off of Black church congregations as an example of what he's saying. So he says, Black church congregations that continued to do the patient work of preparation necessary to create a people sufficient for the coming struggle. That's kind of his example of how churches build countercultural habits. But then you go on to say, well, except that the Black church specifically ended up being a very political, extremely political kind of engaging body in itself. So you say, Hauerwas seemingly ignores the fact that Black Christians in general, Black churches in particular, have modeled the very form of Christian politics that Hauerwas has spent his career discrediting. And I think that's such a good way of putting it. I mean, I don't like to hate on Hauerwas, but also sometimes I just can't help myself a bit. And I think that you articulate it in a way that's really responsible. And I don't know how to put that in the form of a question other than to say I really felt thankful that someone said that.
Yeah, I think too. I think something I tried to do, I'm sure I fell short, and people. Black people in particular, people of color in general. I mean, you really should be suspicious. I'm white, but something I try to do is to say, what if, rather than seeing anti-Blackness supremacy in particular, or white supremacy in general as an ethical issue, right, or a political issue, what if we kind of tried to re-examine everything from the perspective that this thing exists, right, that this is real, rather than, and I think, there are theologians, Catholic theologians, white Catholic theologians, Alex Mikulich, who that's their, they've given their professional lives to trying to say I'm the only white person that cares about this. But sometimes I think white Catholics, white Anglo Catholics in particular, do this, and there's reasons for that. Do this with Hispanic Catholics, but I think white people can do this with people of color in general, is kind of using them as mascots. And what I mean by that is using them as evidence that an opinion you would have believed if people of color didn't exist is right? You're just, so I guess one of my critiques of Hauerwas there, and again, a lot of people do this, is to say, look, see, these people of color, look, they agree with me. But you're not actually you're not actually kind of submitting yourself to their experience, right? You're kind of just saying, look, they agree with me, see? And then at the same time, you're making yourself kind of look not racist, right? And super progressive or super leftist or super liberal or something, right? And so what I tried to do, and I'm sure I fell short, is to say, what if we were literally willing to say we've been wrong about everything, or, literally change our minds about everything and just submit to the experience of anti-Blackness. And so that's kind of another reason why I had a beef with what Hauerwas was, in that particular, because he anyways, I mean, because we could go on. I don't want to make this like Hauerwas bashing session, but, so I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. I'll stop.
We'll have to do another episode that's just Hauerwas bashing. Well, focusing more on what you called sacramental realism. Again, as a Protestant, I guess I have a little bit of a different understanding of Eucharist because I'm Protestant. But I thought what you said was kind of interesting, nonetheless, and I tried my best with my Protestant experience to deal with it. But maybe you can explain it a little bit more to me. So you said that it's not just about eating the right food for Eucharist, but eating it in the right way. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And you kind of went on to talk about the real meal. So maybe could you break that down for some of us Protestants? What does this understanding of the Eucharist mean for us?
Well, I think in this sense, could apply to maybe not every type of every Protestant denomination, but I think to some of them. I mean, Anglicans and Luther. There's Methodists perhaps, but so again, we're talking about the habituating thing, and we're taking bodies seriously. Again, if you are receiving the Eucharist or communion, and I think this would apply whether you believe in transubstantiation or consubstantiation, or you believe that communion is not really the real body, whatever is you are going to if you receive the Eucharist in a racially segregated parish, in a racially segregated neighborhood, in a racially segregated society, the body, the Eucharistic body, as in the kind of the church, the people that is going to be formed by that is going to be a racially segregated one, right? Like how can a meal, I mean, again, if we're taking seriously that the Eucharist, and this is whether you believe it's the real presence or don't, or whatever, right? How can a meal, any meal, if we take it seriously that the Eucharist or communion is a meal, how can a meal bring people together who are not physically in the same space? It makes no sense, right? But this is something we say as Catholics, right? That somehow I'm in my, white flight created suburb or whatever rural space or gentrified neighborhood, and I'm going to mass every day. I'm receiving the Eucharist. There's no Black people, or very few Black people, or Black people are disproportionately there in the neighborhood over. How is that going to bring white and Black people together? And certainly, how is that going to bring us together in any sort of egalitarian way? I mean, again, if you think of a real meal, I think I use this example in the book, right? Think of your family meals. If you have a super patriarchal family and dad or grandpa always has to sit at the head of the table and he always cuts the turkey, that's great. That, I'm not saying that your family's invalid. I'm not saying you're not coming together, but you're coming together as a family in a way that affirms patriarchy, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, think about if we go back to slavery times, there were, people that owned slaves in the South. They were super intimate with Black people, right? They were cleaning their clothes and cooking their food, serving their meals. Sometimes they were, having usually or maybe always never consensual sex, right? But so that's somehow a triumph because white and Black, Black people were at the same table, right? So if we just really take it seriously, right? I mean, again, especially for Catholics, there's a lot of energy around, especially when thinking about, women can't be priests or, again, real presence of the Last Supper, right? Well, look at the Last Supper, Jesus, they were eating an actual meal. You know what I mean? It wasn't just we've kind of, this thing has happened over time. And this is not my original idea, but, the Catholic tradition, it used to be the, oh gosh, I'm going to get this wrong. It's been a couple years since I've looked at this. I'm going to get this wrong. It used to be that the community formed by the Eucharist was was considered to be the real body of Christ, and the host was the mystical body of Christ, right? And somehow that got inverted, where so then the host, basically we forgot this is an Augustinian maxim, right? Become what you receive, right? That the point of the Eucharist, that the Eucharist is the body of Christ, but at the same time, what makes it different food is not just what it is, but what it makes us, right? But at least the two go together. So if we take Augustine seriously, become what you receive. Well, if you didn't become what you receive, did you really receive it? So I'm just trying to take what I consider to be a Catholic insight, and maybe it's not an exclusively Catholic insight, right? I don't want to sound like a, chauvinist here, but Catholic insight and other traditions would say if the priest doesn't say the right words, if it's not an ordained priest, right, he's not wearing certain clothes, like you have not confected the Eucharist. That bread and that wine, that's not the Eucharist. So I'm trying to extend that insight that what we do matters, that it's not like a magical process, right? We won't just like snap our fingers and we receive Christ's body, and say, we need to extend it and say, well, what's the racial composition of the neighborhood our parish is in, right? Like, I'm just saying to expand it. Like maybe we ought, and this is like super controversial, maybe we ought to wonder whether certain white spaces, given their history and their current composition, maybe you can't confect the Eucharist in those spaces. Like maybe like the Eucharist, just as we would say, there's no ordained priest, right? Maybe we need to kind of expand the circumstances, right? So that's kind of where I'm going. And I think that part of it, taking seriously that it's like a real meal, and then just like the other part of the real meal is we just, again, think about bonding, like those of us who have done like intentional community or had friends or like been to college or high school who you sit with at lunch, like meals are bonding. I'm not trying to say they're the be all end all, but meals are bonding, but only if they're like real meals. So maybe we also ought to think seriously about the Eucharist becoming a real meal again. Like, I don't know exactly how that would work, but I think at least in the Catholic tradition, something has happened where we think that if the Eucharist were like a real meal, like I'm talking about calories consumed, right? Like a real meal, like the way the Last Supper was, that somehow it couldn't be holy, right? So we've done this weird thing where like the less like a real meal the Eucharist is, like the more holy it is, if that makes sense. But that's weird. It's weird because that's not what the Last Supper was. That's not what Jesus's table fellowship was. And if we're eating Jesus's real body into our real body, everything's gone wacky. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of what I'm doing with the real meal thing. Again, we're just, we're forgetting what it is. Like, it's a meal, and the fact that it would be a meal with calories, right? Why would that make it less holy? I mean, we're eating it, like we're eating Jesus. Like, we can eat Jesus, digest him, excrete him, but it can't be a real meal. I mean, like, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that a lot. There's a lot going on in my head right now that I want to keep pushing, but as we're coming up to the end, I feel like I should probably ask a little bit about some of the turns you make at the very end of your book. So we've been talking about like the kind of critical moves that you make, but you actually make a lot of really interesting, positive, and concrete recommendations. Like you talk about ecclesial reparations is the one that really sticks with me. So we could focus on that. If there's any other ones that really stick out to you, that's cool too. But in addition to this kind of virtue work, you have all these suggestions for what the church could do corporately to address its corporate vices with some kind of corporate virtuous practices. So what do you think that Christians should be maybe like agitating for in their own institutions or communities today?
I mean, I know I wrote a chapter about it, but this is always the hardest question to answer, right? Like, as an ethicist, it's really easy to be like, this is terrible. And it's a lot harder to say, like, this is how we can fix it. But I mean, I think one thing just off the top of my head, and you can bring up other ones. I think Catholics, and I'm sure there's analogs in Protestant traditions. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I hope, there's an analog, like I tell a Catholic story, right? But there's this history, again, because it's our national, it's our habitat, right? I use the concept of habitat, like anti-Blackness supremacy. Like, we are, all of us in the United States, Canada, I'm sure has its version, on and on. We're living in a habitat of anti-Blackness supremacy. So there's a Methodist version of this. There's an Episcopal, there's probably a Jewish version, on and on and on. But I don't think Catholics realize how much of the parochial, like the parish history, has been shaped in every sense, the literal, physical sense, metaphorically, on and on, has been shaped by like a commitment to the preservation of racial segregation, aka the preservation of anti-Blackness supremacy. So, I think something that could be a really powerful start is literally just uncovering. Like, I lived in Chicago for a couple years, a long time ago now. But it was really, it's really amazing. And you can see traces of it. If you go to different parishes, sometimes they have these like little histories on their websites. And, it's funny how like these suburban parishes just all of a sudden they sprung up in like 1955, like you can see there's a tracing of a lot of times suburban parishes opened, at the moment when these suburban areas were exploding because of white flight, right? In a lot of cases, like parishes that were once in the city, like they moved en masse to the suburb to escape Black people, right? That were moving into their neighborhood. So I think there could be a lot of work in just not like a truth and reconciliation. That's kind of like, we use that a lot. But just like I think there'd be a lot of power in dioceses and individual parishes just knowing the history of their parish. And it's, Catholic parishes have a history, but it's a very innocent, very manicured history that does not really tell the whole truth. And you can see the hints of it if you know what you're looking for. You can see where there's things have been obscured or covered up or finessed. But I think that would go, I just think like, and this is like most of the time it's a culpable ignorance, but white Catholics just have no clue, right? They've intentionally forgotten. You'll see them say things like, oh, after World War II, a lot of there was the baby boom and families wanted more space, so they moved to the suburb. Well, that's part of the story. That's part of the reason why people moved to the suburbs after World War II, right? But it's not the whole story, So that'd be off the top of my head. And in terms of like achievability, that's, I think, something that could go a long way. Hopefully. I mean, again, that's kind of, that's me reforming the church from within, doing the opposite of what I said we should do. But again, I don't know. I think that could have some power, some traction.
Well, to round the discussion out, I want to ask you the question that we ask everybody that comes on the Magnificast now. And I think it actually might get at the reforming the church from the outside thing that you just said too. So the stock question is this, and maybe we can reinterpret it in light of the conversation we've been having, but it's what's something that you think Christians should know about the left or like anti-racist movements? And what's something you think that the left should know about Christians?
Oh man, that's a good question. I'm not like this is probably a weakness. I don't know. I think like, what is the left these days? Everything is so, in flux in our context. What is something Christians should know about the left? Okay. Well, this is probably like not that interesting of an answer, but I would say like that there are Christians on the left. Like, I think that would be a start. And I'm, obviously your guys' work has been dedicated to this. Like it's, the left is a non-religious or a non-Christian organization or something. And just to say that, it's a religiously diverse movement, I guess, collection of people. And what should the left know about Christians? Okay. And then what should the left know about Christians? That there are leftists who are Christians. I don't know. That's like a kind of a cop-out answer. I don't really have anything interesting to say, but I think that, but I don't know. I guess I feel like in recent years, I think the moral majority or, the Christian right, the being super Christian strategy isn't like working for the conservatives as much anymore. So they've kind of retreated from that. And then I think the left has kind of sort of reclaimed more of the Christian space. So I don't know, maybe that's not as true as it once was, but that's all I can think of.
Yeah, that's good. You say a lot more about it in whole books. People can follow up there as well. Great. Well, thanks so much, Katie, for being on the show. The book's called Christ Divided, and encourage everyone to go back and listen to the Fugitive Saints episode as well. But we had a blast reading it and chatting about it. So yeah, the work is really important and really helpful, clarifying, accessible, all the things that you want in a good critical theological book.
Thank you. That I appreciate, getting to know you guys a little bit and coming back on and just taking the time to read my work and engage with it. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you liked this episode and you want to know more, you should go buy Katie's books. All of them. Don't just buy Christ Divided, buy Fugitive Saints too. If you also want to... Oh my gosh. Also, if you like this conversation, you should go support us on Patreon. Patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can also find us on all the other social media. Facebook, Twitter... Okay, that's it. Not all the social media, just those few right
no
there.
Instagrams.
No Instagram.
No Snapchats.
Nope, none of them.
No Vines.
No Vines. Okay, yeah, you can... you can also find us on the podcast network, Critical Mediations and Theology Corner. Go check those out and all the other cool shows on them as well. Also, finally, shameless self-plug, Dean is actually really good at making stickers and has gone sticker crazy. He's got a fever and the only cure is more stickers. So
somebody hold me back.
We've been making lots of crazy stickers over the past few weeks, and you can go buy them all in our Redbubble store, Redbubble facebook.com/people/the Magnificast. Go get them all. Gotta collect them all.
Put them on your skateboard. Put them on your church bulletin. Put them on your church sign. Put them on your pastor's door. You can be the coolest youth group vandal you've ever wanted to be.
That's what we all aspire to, really.
The Magnificast guarantee.
All right, well, thanks for listening. All the music in this episode is from Amaria Armstrong, and the outro is by The Illogical Spoon. Take it away, The Illogical Spoon.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.